John 2:13 through 22. Hi, I'm Jesus. I'm walking over to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. I'll see you there. In the temple, I found people selling cattle and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip out of cords, I drove all of them out of the temple, both sheep and cattle. I poured the coins of the money changers out and overturned their tables. And you, dove sellers, get out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market.
Hey, that reminds me where it's written, zeal for your house will consume me.
Excuse me, all of us Jews are wondering, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?
Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days.
It took 46 years to build this temple, and you're gonna raise it in 3 days?
I wasn't talking about that temple. I was talking about my body.
After he was raised from the dead, I and the other disciples remembered that he had said this, and we believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
Friends, we've heard this story before. We had a wonderful retelling, and thank you so much to the Ash family players for retelling the story this morning of Jesus coming to the temple, turning over the tables and driving out the money changers, and saying to them, "You have made my father's house into a den of thieves." Being reminded of scripture and telling them, if you destroy this temple, I can raise it in 3 days. Basically, as Rev Kit said, making a mess and maybe even having some fun with it. And I think that in the past, I often have heard this story told as a sort of allegory for, commerce in religion. Capitalism inside the churches. And it's always felt a bit rich to me to tell this story and to think, honestly, we have fundraisers all the time. We pass the plate every week. We have money in the temple. Who are we, hypocrites, to tell this story, this particular vision of what Jesus was up to when he went to the temple? And to my mind, there are some important things that help put this story in context. I did a little bit of reading this year and reminded myself of the context. And there were some things that were pretty interesting. The first is that, as Bree reminded us, this story comes from John chapter 2. You think this might be graduate school level Jesus, but actually this is the second thing that Jesus does in the Gospel of John. It comes right after the first miracle. All his disciples have seen from him yet is a party trick, turning water into wine so that people could have a nice time at a wedding. They don't know who Jesus is yet exactly, and they certainly don't know that he has opinions about how things are done in the temple. All they know is that Jesus has this capacity to turn water into wine. And so then Jesus goes to the temple, and things in the temple are running as they have for generations. There was a requirement that if you go to the temple to worship, if you're going to make a sacrifice, which you would do for a variety of reasons, that you needed to sacrifice an unblemished animal. And bringing an unblemished animal from home is a little bit of a hassle. Especially even if you had an unblemished animal, there's a chance that it might get a blemish on the way. And then the rules say it's not suitable for sacrifice anymore. So people found it convenient to acquire their unblemished animal once they got there. It's just safer, it's easier for everybody. So you'd go in and you'd get your unblemished animal. And, it wasn't as straightforward as things are now in terms of money. There wasn't one currency that everyone used. And so if you came to the temple, which you might have done from far away, days and days of journey, you might need an opportunity to change your currency into another kind of currency. And I'm not going to say that the money changers in the temple were not making a profit. They were. It was their job. It's as if your job was a bank teller and you went to your job at the temple branch of the bank every day and you got paid and you fed your family that way. Or your job was selling the animals for sacrifice at the temple. None of those people got up that day and thought, well, I'm doing it wrong, but I'm still going to do it. Or let me see how much I can cheat. Or at least most of them probably didn't. And here comes Jesus into the temple to make an enormous mess, to drive the animals out of the temple from the people they belonged to out to get blemishes in the rest of the world where things are not even safe for them. Out they went. And to sweep all the money of all the different currencies off of all the different tables so that it's not even clear who belongs to who or what belongs on which table, who came with what. You better hope they had some records. I sort of think they did. Dump it all in a pile. And to my mind, the reaction of those money tellers was actually surprisingly reasonable. First, you hear from the disciples, they say, oh, this reminds me of scripture. This reminds me of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 46, a psalm of David where he says, zeal for my Father's house consumes me. They're making excuses for Jesus a little bit. They're saying, oh, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but it looks like zeal for his Father's house has consumed him. And the Jews, the money changers or whoever else was there, say to him, help us get on board. Help us understand what your plan is here. We're not necessarily, they're a little bit gentle with him. They say, just help us see what your plan is. Help us see why you did this. Help explain. And Jesus doesn't actually do all that much to help explain. Instead, he says, I'll show you bigger things than this. I'll show you taking the temple down. In 3 days, I'll bring it back. And they're looking around and they're thinking, this is someone who's literally just swept a bunch of stuff in a big pile and driven all the animals out. He seems like the type to take a sledgehammer to the temple next. And they're thinking, maybe he doesn't realize that it took us 46 years to build this thing. It would be pretty inconvenient to take it down now. And I certainly don't think you're going to be able to put it back in 3 days. This seems like a person who's a little unhinged. And then we get, of course, the little bit of commentary in the gospel reading where we hear, of course, he wasn't, in hindsight, writing post-resurrection, we can say, we know that he wasn't talking about the physical temple. He was talking about the temple of his body, which of course would be resurrected in 3 days. It's all foreshadowing all of that, right? But I found this time through that I had so much sympathy for those folks going to the temple court, the area of all nations, it's called, where they were doing all that money changing and selling for worshipers' convenience, just going about their daily lives and preparing for people to worship as they had for generations, and Jesus showing up and saying, no, you're doing this all wrong. It made me think a little bit this year of people talking about abolishing the police, defund the police, right? Get rid of them. After the tragic and horrible murder of George Floyd and so many others, Breonna Taylor, The calls were loud and clear, and to those who had caught the vision, it seemed obvious. To say defund the police is a representation of a vision that the world could be radically different than it is. A vision that the world could turn, that things could really change. A vision of a world where people don't need implements of violence to coerce each other. A vision of a world where communities keep each other safe, where people have everything they need, where people share their belongings, where we don't have to have police. And if you've caught that vision, if that vision is clear in your mind, then it doesn't really matter that pollsters, for example, say, you know, defund the police is a polarizing message, and we shouldn't talk about it that way. We should instead say police reform, and we should talk about care, and we should talk about, you know, reduction or an increase in something else, and we should talk about incremental steps because those poll better. If you've caught the vision, it can be hard to even think about those polls. It can be hard to even remember what it was like before you caught that vision. And it made me think about what the scripture reading said about that reference to the Psalm. Zeal for my Father's house consumes me. Zeal for that vision, zeal for that new world consumes me. Myself, my rational self, myself that's able to say what's the most practical here, has been consumed as by a fire. That's not left. What's left is the vision. And I don't even have space to listen to those polls. I don't even have space to listen to the money changers in the temple say, well, buddy, this is how we've always done it. Maybe there could be some reforms. Maybe there could be something a little bit better, but like, help us understand what you're doing here, because all we can see is that you're just dismantling our temple worship. You're just changing things into chaos. I think Jesus had a vision of a new temple. I think Jesus had a vision of a new relationship with God. I think Jesus had a vision of a Father's house, of the house of God encompassing the whole world. It can be hard to find words for that kind of vision. And so Jesus is in the temple, feeling absolutely consumed, torn apart by the difference between what he sees with his eyes and what he sees with his heart. Torn apart by that difference between the money changers, the commerce, the business, the animals, the details of this, and the vision where he knows in his heart, it doesn't have to be like this. God doesn't care about your unblemished animals. God doesn't care about your money changing. God doesn't care that you do the particulars of this right. God doesn't even particularly care that you come to this spot. This temple, this house that you spent 46 years building, this is the temple. This is where God meets you, and this can be rebuilt in 3 days. You can take it all the way down. God doesn't care about any of this. God cares what's in this temple, in your own heart. But finding the words to try to explain to someone who has not seen it can feel impossible. And so I think Jesus did something that I would put somewhere in the middle of a spectrum, where one end of it is performance art and the other end of it is a temper tantrum. Somewhere on that spectrum, somewhere right about in the middle, is this action where Jesus quickly whips together a braided cord and drives all the animals out, as if to say none of these are necessary, and this is all just distracting, and dumps all the money on the floor, as if to say this is all imaginary. Possessions are imaginary. the difference between people who use one kind of money and another, the difference between people who have a lot and people who have a little. The idea that these coins have worth, it's all an illusion. And the truth of the situation is so much bigger and so much more beautiful. And of course, like a lot of performance art and like a lot of temper tantrums, it doesn't exactly communicate. Not everybody in the crowd is able to immediately see the vision that Jesus is trying to portray. Not everybody in that crowd is able to understand it. The disciples have at least intuited zeal for my Father's house, but the money changers, well, they're not exactly stuck. They're not exactly resistant, but they say, show us, help us, teach us. We want to come with you. There is something compelling about this act. I kind of want to come along, but I just don't see it. It's the same with this conversation about the police, really, where people say, oh, well, sure, it's a beautiful vision until you need them. It's a beautiful vision until someone breaks into your house. It's a beautiful vision until you're held up at gunpoint or you're threatened or there's some need. And in that moment, you're going to wish you hadn't defunded the police. And they're not necessarily wrong, or at least not entirely. It's a big gap between the dream of a post-policing world and the world we live in now. And having the vision of what things maybe could look like in the future does not necessarily get us there. And I don't blame the ones who don't have the vision in the scripture or in the world now. In fact, Jesus said later on, much later than this, after he was resurrected, to Thomas, who wanted to put his hands in Jesus' side and test out to know for sure, Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Blessed are those who don't quite have that final vision yet and still try to figure out how to take a step towards it. Blessed are every one of those money changers who don't charge more than they need to, who don't gouge people. Blessed are those sellers of unblemished animals who came to the temple with care. Blessed especially are the ones who maybe occasionally gave a discount to someone who seemed especially in need of prayer and who couldn't quite afford it. Blessed are each of those people who offered mercy, who showed a tiny vision of the world to come, even when they didn't quite have the vision. And blessed is Jesus in this story. Blessed are the visionaries. Blessed are the ones who say, I have seen, who try against all odds to communicate that vision, to say it could be different than this and the world is about to turn. Blessed are all of them. We are still somewhere on that continuum between temper tantrum and performance art. We are still somewhere on that continuum between the temple in Jerusalem and the temple of our own hearts. We are still somewhere in between. And on some topics, some of us have the vision, and on some topics, different ones of us do. And some of us spend a lot of time with the vision of a world differently. And some of us are nose to the grindstone, figuring out the incremental small things to try to make things better in the here and now. And in that continuum, in between the tiny steps and the big vision, God meets us there. We, each of us, have our different work to do. And my prayer for us is that we will continue to be open to God meeting us exactly where we are. That when God places a new vision into our hearts, we will allow ourselves to be consumed by zeal, and that when God places that vision into one of our colleagues or friends or family members or community members, we will be generous with them, asking them to share with us, inviting them to try to kindle that vision in our own hearts. And in the meantime, taking whatever small steps we can towards that new world. May it be so. May it be so. May it be so.